It is, for me, a great honor and privilege to be sharing a stage with Dr. Kissinger, former Secretary of State, Nobel laureate, and long time China hand. Dr. Kissinger first came to China more than 40 years ago. He was the first American officially to be there who can talk about it to us today. He has made more than 80 trips to China since then, including one to be with us here today. He's written many books, and the latest is, as you know, called On China. I wanted to ask Dr. Kissinger just to remember for us what it was like, your first trip here.
But on that first trip, we were in the position that President Nixon had decided to do this with only 3 or 4 people knowing about it, because he did not want a big debate before he had actually done it.
And this was a secret trip. You had to fly through Pakistan, ditch the press along the way, and fly on to China.
So I went on a trip to Saigon, Bangkok, New Delhi, before we ended up in Pakistan. And the program in these other places was made deliberately so boring that no newsman had any further interest. And so by the time we reached Pakistan, there was only an Associated Press stringer left, and he was not super energetic.
And then you faked an illness, didn't you, to further put it
the way one had to explain how I disappeared.
You've met now, I presume, every Chinese leader from Mao on. And China now has a new generation of leaders. It strikes me that Xi Jinping not only represents new leadership, but a generation of leaders different from the past, in that this is the first generation of Chinese leaders where most of them were actually sent down in the Cultural Revolution to live in the countryside. How do you see that generational change, that experience, shaping this generation of leaders?
Well, every generation of Chinese leaders has represented a Chinese experience. And they have been quite distinct in personality, in emphasis they put, and they have all been very distinct personalities. So this is the generation actually of the sons of the victims of the Cultural Revolution.
Right, so their parents were persecuted often, and the children, this generation, were often sent to the countryside, like Xi Jinping was.
Yes.
President of China worked in a pig farm for 7 years.
But what one has to understand about that generation is that the victims of the Cultural Revolution were sent to the countryside. But at the end, the Red Guards who sent them there were also sent to the countryside when Mao decided to end the Cultural Revolution. So as a result, there is a community of experience actually between victims and guards in this generation. And we're just at the very beginning of what looks like a very sweeping reform process.
Do you have a sense of what the key reforms in that will be as China grapples with managing this very large and increasingly complex economy?
Well, I've heard their leaders speak of enhancing the legal system so that their objective criteria, more transparency, very strong emphasis on anti-corruption, and these are huge undertakings. But the leaders that I'm familiar with speak about them with great passion.
You, of course, are the original architect of a U.S.-China relationship. What advice do you have for China's incoming leaders, the new leaders, as well as the U.S. side for dealing with each other?
And I think both sides have to understand that there is a cultural problem here.
I want to come to that in a moment, but let me rewind to something you said a couple of minutes ago. You made the point that China and the U.S. start from typically a very different baseline in their assessments of each other and how the world should be. So could we take that analogy of U.S.-China relations and the difficulties to the business world for a second? Because, of course, you counsel companies on how to do business around the world. What are the common mistakes you see foreign Americans, Westerners, other foreigners make when they try to do business in China that simply results from a difference of misunderstanding?
When we talk, before I get to the business question, when we talk about the different position from which China and America start, one has to remember this. America in its, by Chinese standards, very short history, has never had a powerful country on its borders.
One of the striking things about being based in Asia is you frequently hear Chinese leaders talk about China's challenges, weaknesses, and yet from the U.S. side or the West side, you usually hear people talk about China as a juggernaut. Why this difference? What do Chinese leaders see?
Well, Chinese leaders have gone through a searing history. This generation that we now encounter, the generation 50 and below, that is the first generation in 200 plus years that has not undergone colossal tragedies, revolutions, civil wars, devastations, interrupted, destroyed lives.
You raise a good point about the changes, of course, since the Cold War, but it strikes me that one of the things we're seeing now is simply that our diplomatic architecture was built for a time when nation states controlled things, and now we have a number of non-state actors. We have terrorists, we have cyber terrorists, we've got even environmental challenges. You need to look no further than the window to see that here in China. How do we deal with all those challenges? Do we have the right diplomatic architecture?
Well, it's obvious that we don't know how to deal with this yet in a comprehensive way. The international system as we grew up, in which we grew up, was based on the nation state. And the nation state was supposed to control the activities within its borders, and foreign policy was actions that transcended these borders. But now we have a loss of control of nation states over their own territory.
One of the other things that's changing now in this region that is fairly unprecedented is simply the way that globalization is changing the balance of power in Asia. Normally, military power and economic power go together, but what we're seeing now in Asia is that the U.S. remains the strongest military power, but most of its military allies, all of its Asian military allies, actually do much more trade with China than they do with the United States. How is that shifting relations out here?
In the end, as I said before, the challenge of China is not a military one. Of course, there's a military component. That the United States has to remain competitive. That if our political system is dysfunctional, and I must say, when I look at the high-speed train system in China and see what this represents not only with respect to technology, but with respect to changing the culture of China when the various regions can now reach each other on a mass basis, then it's clear that we in America have to develop a comparable momentum in our own society.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is if you're Japan or Korea or the Philippines or Indonesia or Thailand or Australia, your biggest export market is now China, but your biggest military ally, your military ally, is the United States. Doesn't that increase tensions?
Yeah, but then my question is, what are you going to do about it? You can,
That's what I was asking you.
If you fall behind economically, then because of your own failure to act with vision, you cannot then complain about the consequences.
I have one last question for you, which is globalization good on the whole, and for whom exactly? What's the realpolitik of globalization?
But the people who drive globalization, their job is to maximize their benefits on a global basis. The people who drive politics, their job is to deal with a society. Of course, they also deal globally. But to answer your question, of course, globalization is good, but one has to understand that the motivation of people is not only economic.
On that note, unfortunately, we're out of time. I've greatly enjoyed the chance to talk with you, Dr. Kissinger, and I know that the audience has very much enjoyed hearing you.
I enjoyed being with you.